I'd like to introduce Dr. Paul Peterson. He is, in fact, the editor-in-chief of Education Next, a publication that some of you were able to pick up. But if not, these are available through the website, Dr. Peterson? Sure. Okay. Dr. Paul Peterson is the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government and Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance at Harvard University, and Editor-in-Chief of Education Next, a journal of opinion and research on education policy. Dr. Peterson is the author or editor of more than 100 articles and 22 books. After receiving his PhD from the University of Chicago, he was a professor for many years there in the Departments of Political Science and Education. Most recently, he was awarded the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation Prize for Distinguished Scholarship, part of its Excellence in Education Award program. He has also been appointed to a Department of Education independent review panel to advise the agency in evaluating the No Child Left Behind Act. So if you could join me in please welcoming Dr. Peterson.
Thank you. Well, this is a hot topic, as you all know, and a lot of the conversation is more in terms of rhetoric than it is based on a look at what's actually happened, in part because it's very difficult to get information on a governmental program in the first few years of its operation. Sometimes you only know its long-term impact 10, 20, 30 years later. But some things have been learned over the past 5 years, and I thought I would talk about some of them, not all of them. And I'm going to focus mainly on the measuring stick and the accountability system and less on the consequences provisions. If you fail, then various things can happen to you after 2, 3, and 5 years. But if you want to bring that up in the questions, please feel free to do so, because I have some thoughts on that as well that's based on the research that's out there. So anyhow, I have a few lessons, 11 I guess. And the first one is that there is evidence out there that accountability works to some extent if you're interested in school reform. And sort of place this in a broader context, if you want to change a service delivery system and enhance it, there are two fundamental directions in which you can go. One is to use markets to create competition so that service providers respond to consumer demands more effectively. And a lot of thought in healthcare service delivery is focused on how do you create the right kind of market so that you can have public financing, but you get all the benefits of competition among doctors and other providers and pharmaceuticals, et cetera. So the strategy that has been followed in healthcare service delivery has been to use a mix of regulation and competition. Now, in education, this service delivery system, also publicly financed, even more so than in the healthcare delivery system, the strategy has been mainly to have government provision of services as well as government financing. And so if you're not going to move to a market system, that is to having a choice-based intervention through charter schools, vouchers, tax credits, private management of public schools, various options out there on the table that they're actually talking about at the World Bank later today. If you're not going to pursue that strategy, then the alternative reform strategy out there is accountability. To make sure that the people within the system are responding in the way that you would like them to respond, given the fact that you have certain objectives. In this case, you want students to learn. So the message that I'm going to bring today is basically that accountability can bring you some benefits. But so far, we haven't figured out how to get the most out of an accountability system. And from that, you can draw the conclusion we should give up on accountability and go to a market-based reform, or we should give up on accountability and just let the professionals decide what's best, as we have in the past, or you could conclude that we need to improve our accountability system. So overall, I would say that there's some evidence out there that accountability has some positive effects. And I think some of the best evidence out there comes from the 1990s. As I pointed out, initially, it's very hard to study things that have happened only recently because you've got to get the data collected and analyzed and looked at. And the best quality data we have on the effectiveness of educational programs tends to come from the National Assessment of Education Progress. And it's sort of interesting that the National Assessment of Education Progress is the very beginnings of accountability in the United States on a national scale. Prior to that, the only way we could get systematic quantitative information about the quality of our educational system was from SAT scores. And from mid-1950s to 1970, there was a steady decline in SAT scores, which generated a lot of controversy in the United States over the quality of our educational system. People said, well, our schools are going to hell in a handbasket. And other people said, no, just more kids are taking the SAT because more people are going on to college. And so, did I know? Okay, so the National Assessment of Education Progress was established in the late 60s and was put into the field around 1970 as a way of measuring the performance of all the kids in school, not just those who were going on to college and were taking the SAT. So we began measuring performance at 4th grade and 8th grade and in high school, or ages 9, 13, and 17. And we did this in math and reading, and later on added science, and later on some other subjects as well. And the assessment was called the National Assessment of Education Progress. It was sort of optimistic that we were going to show the kinds of progress our system was making, and once we got the right measuring stick put into place. But there was a lot of opposition to creating any kind of an accountability system, much more so then than now. And so it was agreed that no state would ever know how well it was doing. No district would ever know how well it was doing. The only aggregation would be at the national level, or by ethnic group, or by region of the country. And that way nobody could be held accountable. No specific individual could be, or entity could be held accountable for the National Assessment of Education Progress results. That was the compromise that was reached that launched our first accountability system. Well, the surprising thing that we found out once we put the NAEP into place was that test scores did not improve. They got worse, and then they got better in some places and not so well in others, and they sort of went up and down. So that generated more demands for more accountability. And many governors, particularly in southern states, but it was a nationwide movement, both political parties began to support stronger accountability measures. And a number of states put into place various kinds of accountability programs during the 1990s, but not all the states. And that provided Rick Hanushek and Mackie Raymond with the opportunity to say, okay, did the states that put into place accountability programs, did the kids learn anything more in those states than in the states where they didn't do it? And to do that, they looked at kids when they were in 4th grade and then 4 years later when they were in 8th grade to see whether the growth from 4th to 8th grade was greater in the states that had the accountability system. Well, that's the results that are reported here on the board that show that the states that did not have an accountability system, you see a little growth, and you see larger growth in those that have what they call the report card accountability, just the facts, what was being reported out to the public. And then there was another set of states that actually gave rewards to schools that showed well in the accountability system, and those states showed even more improvement. So, but these are not big time gains. The effects here, about 1% to 2% of a standard deviation. Now, I'm going to talk about standard deviation quite a bit today, so I want to explain it. A standard deviation, one full standard deviation, is roughly 4 years of schooling between 4th and 8th grade. Students who take the NAEP in 8th grade, on average, perform 1 standard deviation better than students in 4th grade, on average, in the United States. So from 4th grade to 8th grade, you learn 1 standard deviation amount of educational material. So if you're getting 50% of a standard deviation, you're getting about 2 years. If you're getting 25%, you're getting about 1 year's impact. That student is learning 1 year more than otherwise would have. So 1%, 2% is not big, right? That's a pretty minor impact that you're getting out of the accountability systems that were put together by the states initially. Well, if you look at just the raw NAEP scores, and there was a study that just came out this week, I understand, that looked at sort of these raw NAEP scores, you see that this is not in standard deviations here. This is just in raw test score results. So it's not directly comparable to the previous table. But what you can see here is that the accountability gains from 1992, when the accountability was first being put into place, to 2005, are greater in math than in reading and greater in 4th grade than in 8th grade. So the biggest impact is in math, and the biggest impact is in the elementary schools, not the middle schools. And here we have the change in the NAEP scores for black students, where you see bigger impacts, closing of the test score gap. And here you get the results for Hispanic students. You see the same kind of impact. So you can say that accountability, if you believe that accountability was the driving force over this period of time, and you can come up with other factors that you might prefer to use as the explanatory variable, but it's consistent. Let me put it this way. The overall NAEP results are consistent with the conclusion that accountability has had some positive impacts, especially for minorities. But accountability, as we know it, is not transforming schools. And the best evidence we have on that is also from the NAEP, where you have high school, the 17-year-old data, which is ultimately what we really care about. How much do kids know upon graduation from high school? And in the high school case, you see that the test score gains in mathematics are very small, just a little bit higher at the end than at the beginning for white students. And for black students, you see some big gains in the 80s, which have petered out in the 90s and slid a bit, and the same is true for Hispanics. And that's a trend which is even more evident when you look at we'll hold the questions till the end. In the case of reading, you have a pretty flat line here, and you have a fairly steep improvement for black students, but a tailing off in recent years. And you have the same pattern for Hispanics. And that cannot be explained by the fact that there are more Hispanics and blacks staying on to the completion of high school today than in the past, because graduation rates are no higher today than they were in 1990. In fact, they've gone down. So there's a lot of evidence that whatever improvements were being made at the elementary and secondary school level, whatever benefits we were getting at that level have not translated into higher level performance by students when they graduate from high school. So from that, one cannot jump to the conclusion that the No Child Left Behind's measuring stick is flawed. But this is my third lesson, and let me try to explain to you what the problems are with the accountability system that we have so far put into place. And I don't want to be critical of this measuring stick, except to say we need to improve it, because it may have been the best measuring stick we could put together in 2002 when the first national accountability system was being put into place. It was probably a compromise that had to be reached at that particular point in time. But whether or not that is the compromise we should stick with in the future is a large question. let's just define it for a second here. No Child Left Behind says that 100% of the students at a school must meet the proficiency standard established by the state by the year 2014. And that every year, during the intervening period, schools must make adequate yearly progress towards that objective. And subgroups, ethnic and income and other subgroups, must make similar progress. So what this really says is that if you're almost proficient now, if 90% of your students are proficient, as they are in my hometown of Wellesley, Massachusetts, you don't have to do much. You can pretty much just let things slide, and you can make it to 100% proficiency by 2014, or with a little extra effort, perhaps, focusing on the specific students that are of concern. But if you are a student in the middle of Boston, or even more so in other large cities, where proficiency levels may be as low as 10%, you've got to make absolutely fantastic gains in order to get to 100% by the year 2014. And every school is held to this same standard, making adequate yearly progress, but the meaning of that phrase is completely different depending on where the school is starting out. Now, the idea behind No Child Left Behind is that every child can learn. And that's a great idea. It's a great egalitarian ideal. But it also implicitly assumes that every child arrives at school with the same capacities to learn, that they've had the same support system before they arrived at school and while they're at school, so that every school can be able to. And the only reason my town of Wellesley is at 90% proficiency today is because the schools are so much better in Wellesley than they are in the middle of Boston. And it has nothing to do with the income and the education of the parents in the community. And of course, most of us don't believe that. But No Child Left Behind is based on that theory. Now, quite apart from this essential problem, you have the fact that state standards, state definitions of proficiency vary enormously from one state to the next. One of the compromises in No Child Left Behind, probably an essential compromise that could not have been passed without this. It's great talking here in Washington because you understand this compromise business so well. But was that the states were to define proficiency. Now, the NAEP has its own definition of proficiency. The NAEP standard of proficiency was set up back in 1970, and it was expected that we would show annual progress towards proficiency in the United States. And according to the NAEP definition of proficiency, 27% of the students in the United States are proficient today. Well, some of the states have essentially adopted the NAEP standard of proficiency. And my colleague Rick S. and I have actually given those states an A. Missouri, Wyoming, South Carolina, Maine, and Massachusetts. And then the other states are graded relative to how close their standard of proficiency is to the NAEP. And we estimate that by saying, what percentage of the kids in this state are proficient on the NAEP exam, and what percent are proficient on the state assessment of proficiency? So if you have a state where they're almost identical, as in the case of Massachusetts, then we say the NAEP standards and the state standards are essentially the same. And if you have a state like Tennessee, where they're dramatically different, where you have relatively few students proficient under the NAEP and almost all students are by state standards, we give it an F. So you can see that the variation among the states is very large. In fact, it's so large, the United States government, Department of Education, has released a report that tells us how many schools are failing to make adequate yearly progress in every state. So we know how many schools, what percentage of schools are failing to make adequate yearly progress in every state. And we know the percentage of students who are proficient according to the NAEP in every state, which is our measure of school quality. So we say a state, it's not just school quality, it's school and community and family quality, the whole package that goes into making a student proficient. So we sort of call that school quality in a sort of misleading way, I guess, but there should be a correlation between the two. If the kids are learning in that state, then there shouldn't be very many schools that are not making adequate yearly progress. And in fact, there is a correlation. The correlation is 0.31 in the expected direction. The more the kids learn in that state, the fewer the schools that are said to be not making adequate yearly progress. But a 0.3 correlation is a pretty weak one, especially for an accountability system. Accountability system, you'd like to see something like about 0.8. That would give you really good information about what's really going on. The correlation between the toughness of the standards and the percentage of schools that are failing is even higher, 0.4. So if you want to know what's causing a particular state to have a lot of failing schools, your first guess should be it's got high standards. And if you say, oh, this school doesn't have many failing schools, it must be great. No, it just set low standards. School quality comes into the picture, but it's not as important as the standards that were set. Now, this is all the data for all the states showing just what I said in detail. So, for example, Massachusetts, 43% of the kids are failing, 43% of the schools are failing to make AYP, which is remarkable since Massachusetts has a very a relatively high performance relative to other states on the NAEP. In fact, I think it's number 1 or number 2. It's right up at the top. But yet it's also near the top in terms of how many schools are said to be failing. Well, that's because it has such high standards. North Carolina is the opposite case. 42% of the schools are failing, but only 32% of the students are said to be proficient. So I could go on in more detail. You can see this in your table. You may have some questions about particular states. I'll try to answer them as best I can. I can't pretend to know exactly what's going on in every state. But you can argue, and argue correctly, that if we use the NAEP standard of proficiency, we've set too high a standard, that actually Massachusetts has made a mistake, South Carolina has made a mistake in setting the proficiency bar as high as it has. Because the United States in math in 8th grade has only 27%, has only 27% of its students proficient in math in 8th grade. 27% meet the NAEP standard nationwide. And you can say, well, a lot more can be expected of the United States than that, because after all, 51% of the students in Belgium perform at that level. We know this from TIMSS data. TIMSS data can be related to NAEP data. Somebody's done the connection for me. So we know that 51% of the students in Belgium are proficient, 61% of the Japanese, on Taiwan, 61%, Hong Kong, 64%, South Korea, 65%, and Singapore, 73%. Well, maybe we'll never have as good a system as Singapore, but there is something to be said for the whole idea that no child needs to be left behind. We could be a lot better than we are. But the other side of the coin is there's not a country in the world that has gotten to 100% proficiency. So if we use the NAEP standard of proficiency and we say that we are going to have every child proficient by the year 2014, we know, as a matter of fact, this will not happen. There's no way we're going to get from 27% to 100% if even in Singapore, which has the highest educational performance of any country in the world, has students, only 73% are proficient. Now, if you take the NAEP definition of proficient as, they call something basic. You can also perform at a basic level on the NAEP. And if you take the basic level on the NAEP, then the United States is 67% of the kids in the United States in 8th grade on the math test are proficient at a basic level in the United States, 67%. But these countries, 90 to 95% are. So if you took the basic as your NAEP, as your level of proficiency, then you could possibly say that with some exceptions, there's always going to be, like I have a disabled son myself, who's never going to be proficient by these standards. There's going to be some people who suffer a severe disability that will never make it. But putting those students to one side, you can get to 100% basic proficiency, and that can be challenge enough for the system. So that would be another way. If you wanted to go to a national standard, you don't need to go to the national NAEP proficiency standard. You could go to the NAEP basic standard, and then you would set up a standard that would provide you with a challenge, but a realistic challenge. Hard to sell politically, obviously. Well, as it is, states have a variety of accountability systems of their own, and there's a lot of conflict between the state and the national standards. I'm going to skip over this point just for the sake of time, but it is a fact out there that there's a lot of confusion at the state and local level, because in the state of Florida, students can get an A, B, C, D, or an F, and 60% of the schools get an A, almost half of which fail under NCLB standards. So if you're told your school is an A but it's failing, it's very confusing to parents. So you've got all these ambiguities out there when you've got two accountability systems going simultaneously. But the worst problem with the measuring stick is that it does not identify good schools. And I have a very simple definition of a good school. My definition of a good school is one where kids are learning, where their performance on a test improves more over the course of a year, because you know what they did last year, we know what the same child is doing this year, and that child is learning more than, on average, at this school. The children at this school are learning more than, say, the average school in the state. So all the schools that are above average are schools where the kids are learning more, on average, than elsewhere in the state. Call those above average schools. Now, you would think that No Child Left Behind would do a good job of picking out the schools where kids are learning more as compared to the schools where they're learning less. But if you're a parent and you're going to pick your school simply on the basis of what No Child Left Behind tells you about the school, that it's making adequate yearly progress or not making adequate yearly progress, you're going to make a mistake 30% of the time. And you can get it right because it's just a pass-fail system. No Child Left Behind automatically gets it right 50% of the time. It does get it right 70% of the time, better than just a flip of the coin would get you, but it's still making a mistake 30% of the time, at least in the state of Florida, which is the one place that we've been able to really take a careful look at this. It is the case that the state of Florida has this marvelous data set that all states should have. That's another one of my recommendations, that all states should be able to track student performance from year to year. So you know exactly how much every kid is doing at every school. and whether the kid moves to another school or not, and you can track individual progress. Now, 20 years ago, that wasn't possible. Today, technology has made that a possibility. So you can see how students are progressing. And there's always going to be some mistakes and so forth, but on average, you're going to get a picture of which schools are moving kids more quickly down the road to progress than not. So in Florida, we were able to do this little exercise, and as a result, we were able to show that, in fact, the measuring stick used by NCLB makes a mistake 30% of the time. And then we compared that to the Florida's own measuring stick, and I won't go into the details on that, but their stick does a much better job. So it's not like you have to have the NCLB measuring stick. There's others out there that can do a much better job of telling you which is a good school. Okay, but in order for Florida to get a better system, they had to build this database. And that's something which is being done in North Carolina and Texas and a few other places around the country. But that is the most important thing that needs to be done as part of the new legislation, is to create the database that will allow the tracking of students over time. Now, there are a lot of people out there who agree with me that accountability system has to focus on student growth, improvement in student performance, and that No Child Left Behind, that sets this standard, which can be extremely challenging in some states and not challenging at all in other states, is a crazy system and should be replaced by one that shows which schools are actually more effective at raising student performance. There's a lot of people in state and local government, but what Congress needs to tell state and local government is, okay, if you want to do that, you've got to put together a system that will allow the kind of tracking of student performance so that we can come up with accurate estimates of how well that school is doing. And it can be done, is being done, but it's only being done in a very few places, and there's a lot of opposition to it, and there's a lot of privacy groups that are opposed to it. I've never quite understood why it is that a teacher should not know how much a child is learning in her classroom, or an administrator should not know how much the kids are learning in a teacher's classroom, but there is a lot of opposition out to creating the database that would be necessary to have a better accountability system. A little bit of a side point. It gets to the consequences. We looked at the effect of the No Child Left Behind. If you say that you're failing to make adequate yearly progress once, there are no consequences under No Child Left Behind. Twice, kids at your school are given the opportunity to go to another public school in the district. So is this a consequence that bothers schools? Well, does this motivate them to perform better? Well, to find that out, what we did in Florida was we asked the question, those schools that failed once, did they try harder the next year than those who almost failed, but just barely avoided failing? So we sort of said it was a little bit of a luck of the draw as to which one failed and which ones didn't fail. We looked at just those right on the borderline, and we could see no effect at all. We could see no sign that the school was responding to the No Child Left Behind incentives to improve the public school choice provisions. But then we also looked at the Florida's voucher provision when it was still in place. It's no longer in place, which said to F schools, your kids can get a voucher if you get another F and go to a private school, which was a much stronger threat than the public school choice threat under No Child Left Behind. And there we found gains of 10% of a standard deviation, which is a lot more than the 1% improvement that we saw of the accountability system. It's not nirvana, but it's a sizable impact given the relatively low cost of the intervention. But finally, or almost finally, I'd like to make the case that an accountability system that doesn't hold students accountable is not an accountability system. And I start with a simple point that Ted Sizer made. He was the dean of the School of Education at Harvard many years ago. And he says the student is the crucial actor, whether we adults like it or not. He or she decides what has been purveyed. And so much of what we think about and talk about when we talk about accountability is we assume students are widgets, that they're just objects, that they're being manipulated, and that we have to get the adults to change their behavior, not the students. But it is the student who is the most important person that affects whether or not that person is going to learn. The mother is probably the second most important person. The dad may be important sometimes, more important today than used to be. But the mother we know is very, very important. But the student himself or herself is the most important. So what happens when you hold students accountable? Well, there are a few examples out there of what's happening when students are held accountable. And one is the whole question of whether you get promoted to fourth grade if you failed your test in third grade. And traditionally in the United States, we have promoted kids regardless of their performance in elementary school. But not in Florida, where they introduced this accountability. You had to pass this test or you were at very severe risk of staying in third grade the next year. And this diagram here compares the year that this was put into place with the year before, when the old system was in place. And the impact on student performance was somewhere between 6 and 15% of a standard deviation. Pretty significant impacts of a pretty minor intervention. And those students who were kept behind did even better, because those who were not kept behind had gone into fourth grade not knowing their third grade material, and therefore they fell further back. Whereas those who were kept behind actually improved more relative to those who were not held back the previous year, who were in the same category of in the same performance level category. But the other interesting result like this comes from the international data, the TIMSS data, where a German economist has looked to see what's the impact of comprehensive examinations at the end of high school. A lot of countries in the world have these comprehensive examinations. A lot of them don't. The United States falls into the second category. We do not expect performance of a particular content level at the point that you're graduating from high school. This does not prevent you from graduating, but it gives you a grade, an evaluation as you graduate, and determines access to universities. It affects your access to the marketplace, the employment opportunities that are going to be available. And what Ludger-Wussmann has shown is that if you have these examinations and you give local schools a lot of autonomy, he says there's two things that are needed: a lot of local autonomy and some kind of a finally accountability system. And he's looking at 8th graders here. He's not looking at high school graduates, but he's looking at the effect of a high school examination system on 8th graders. And the reason that's interesting is because even by 8th grade, the system is geared up to make sure these kids are going to pass that examination by the time they get through high school. And the impact in terms of standard deviation is 44% in this measure and 76% in this measure, two different measures of how much autonomy the local school was given. So the argument that he makes is that if you're going to really create an effective accountability system, it's got to be meaningful for the marketplace, meaningful for higher education. It's got to be linked to higher education. And it's got to, at the same time, be coupled with a great deal of autonomy. You can't have top-down tight controls. You have to have a lot of flexibility at the bottom of the system. And let me give you one other example of what happened when an accountability system was put into place, and that's from Massachusetts again, where high school examination was put into effect in 2001. And everybody said that no kids will ever pass this examination, but in fact, the percent passing the examination on the first time, you get more chances if you don't pass the first time, has steadily increased since the policy was put into place, even though you don't see much improvement at the 4th and 8th grade level. That's pretty flat in Massachusetts. But motivating these high school students in 10th grade to pass the 10th grade exam, or it's called the high school exam, but a lot of people pass it in 10th grade. I'm not saying it's the perfect examination system, but it does show the effect of creating incentives for students. So if you created incentives for students and you put together a measuring stick that measured growth, a genuine measure of school quality instead of a misleading measure of school quality, then you could start talking about holding teachers accountable for the performance of their students in their classrooms. We can't talk about that until you put all these other pieces of the puzzle together, because you're holding teachers responsible in contexts where they can't be responsible for what's happening. But to hold teachers responsible for their school not making adequate yearly progress can be incredibly misleading. There can be excellent charter schools, there can be excellent inner-city public schools that can't make adequate yearly progress because the expectations are utterly unrealistic, and yet they're held up to scorn in the press for failing to do something they can't possibly do. So you've got to change the measuring stick so that it's a realistic one, an accurate one, a meaningful one. But then you can start putting some other accountability measures into place. And that's it.
Join me in thanking Dr. Peterson. We're going to open the floor to some questions now. Sorry for those of you who didn't get food. Please register if and when you do have the chance, just so we can approximate a number for that. And also, please fill out those surveys if you do have to leave right now. Thank you. We'll start over here.
A question on Lesson 10. Are you saying that the lack of response to the schools having the students having a choice to leave the school, is that because kids are not in fact leaving public schools, or is it because the threat of leaving and going to a private school is stronger than leaving and going to a public school?
Well, in Florida, yes. If a child leaves the school and goes to another public school, the school district gets the same amount of money as previously. If the child goes to a private school, the public school district loses that money. It goes to the private school instead. So the incentives are different in the two cases.
I do, yes. I actually just wondered on the grading of the states on their accountability systems where that information came from.
Well, it's all public information. The states each report on their own websites what percentage of the students are proficient according to state standards, and the NAEP publishes for every state, or almost every state, the percentage that are proficient on the NAEP examination, and then we just compared the one to the other.
I see. So if they're very low on these standards you put forth, then their standards are generally high. Did that make sense?
Standards. Well, question is, what's high?
For instance, Nebraska has a D- on there. That basically means our state standards are very high.
A D- means they're very low.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to ask.
A D- means you get an A for having a high standard in our system. Now, maybe Massachusetts has given a too high a standard, but we gave them an A for effort. And they set the bar very high. And if you got an F, then like Texas did, I think. Texas did a D-.
Okay, so Harvard graded the standards of every state. Is that what this is?
Harvard didn't do anything.
Okay.
Harvard compiled the data. Which all it does is it looks at the state proficiency, percentage of students that are proficient on the state test, as stated by the state, and compares it with the students in that state's performance on the NAEP. And if it's about the same, if it's like 30% in both cases, we give it an A, because then the standard set by the state, that tells us the standard that is set by the state is the same as the standard set by the NAEP. But if a state has 60% of its students proficient, according to its own standards, but 30% by NAEP, then it's going to fall more like getting a C. And if it's got 90% proficient and only 30% proficient on the NAEP, then it's going to get an F. So that's how we get it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a question back on chart number 4. If you have a 0 on chart 4, does that mean that there's been no growth whatsoever in your reading abilities, or that your growth has been equal to the average 4-year growth? almost all the way down to the beginning. It's technically, it's called change in NAEP test scores, all students 92, 98. Yeah, that's it. Now, well, the
So
one,
let's
yeah,
go,
there it
yeah,
is.
let's go to the
Now,
all students
the
one.
one
Yeah.
in the 8th grade reading, does that mean that, in fact, there's been no growth recorded in 4 years, or that the growth is only what you would expect after being in school for 4 years?
What it
zero.
means exactly is that the performance level in 2005 is the same as it was back in 1992. There's been no improvement in average student performance nationwide. I mean, we can say this very clearly. In the case of reading, from 1992, I've forgotten which it is. Our beginning point varies a little bit, but 1992 to 2005, the student performance in 8th grade in reading is exactly the same. It hasn't changed over that period of time. In contrast to 4th grade in math, where there's been a lot of gain. So actually, those are pretty big gains in math that have been obtained. And if you want to write a positive story about American education, look at math gains in 4th grade. And if you read the newspapers about all the improvements in American education, they're going to tend to focus in on what's happening in 4th grade math, or 4th graders in general, because you've gotten a lot of positive developments over the last 10 to 15 years. And so when the president says accountability is working, or Representative Miller says accountability is working, that's the kind of data they're going to bring to the table. They don't bring the 17-year-old data to the table, because 17-year-old data doesn't show much improvement. It shows, if anything, a decline over the same period of time, especially when you put in the graduation rate data. So it's all a matter of whether you look at the little kids or the older kids. And if what we were doing with little kids was carrying on through the system, then, we could be feeling pretty good about the progress that we're making. It's not spectacular like No Child Left Behind expects, but it would make you feel good. But when you see that all fading away by age 17, then you say, what was it? Was this just a mirage? Yeah. Well, like I said at the beginning, there's 3 conclusions you can draw from this. One is that you should just go back to letting professionals run their schools and not tell them how to do it. Or another conclusion you could make is you need to go to a competitive system. And the third conclusion is you got to improve your accountability system. The conclusion I don't think you can come to is the one that there's a lot of political support for today, and that is don't do anything different than we're doing now. Keep the law intact for the next 6 years, wait till 2014. And it's quite clear that by 2014, we will have lots of schools in the United States not making adequate yearly progress. So something's going to change somehow. I don't know exactly what it's going to be. No, your points are well taken. Creating a competitive system is much more practical in the urban-suburban setting than it is in the rural setting. But, precise statements about that I don't have backup for. Yeah.
Can we just see the next slide, because the numbers are not on the handout?
Yeah, because that does show that the gains by African Americans are much more than for the average student in general. Yeah.
Can I ask you about your last slide, student performance on Massachusetts accountability exam? You started to talk about incentive for students. You mentioned that the 10th grade improvements, you can clearly see that makes a big improvement. The 4th and 8th are pretty flat. Yeah, that was that.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. You said briefly, well, if you provide an incentive for students, it clearly shows that there's some response. I just didn't know, what was the incentive that was being provided, and was it being provided for?
Oh, you can't graduate from high school unless you pass this exam.
Oh, so that's why the 4th and 8th graders don't seem to care about it as 4th grade, 8th grade.
There's no consequences for 4th graders, no consequences for 8th graders.
There is for the 10th.
But there is consequences for those. Thank you. That's a helpful question.
Great. Thank you.
Anyone else have another question they'd like to ask? Okay, well, Dr. Peterson has about 5 minutes. If you'd like to speak with him afterwards, then we're going to jet him over to the World Bank. But thank you for coming, and